Thank you for coming this afternoon, in this rainy afternoon. I feel I'm amongst friends. I feel I know some of you quite well. I feel also that I'm probably going to learn a lot from you this afternoon. I'd rather frame it rather than as a question and answer at the end, more as a discussion amongst ourselves, without any kind of hierarchical presupposition that somehow I have some omniscient insight into the complexities that I suspect a lot of people here will know more about than I. I've got an hour or so to try and come up with some ideas that may be of interest. I think some of them might be challenging, perhaps. In fact, I know they're challenging because they challenge what I would understand as some of the default positions within critical academic scholarship. And I know that because they challenge myself in a way in terms of what I've done in the past. And let me just explain a little bit about that before I move into the topic proper. I think within the critical world of media and communication studies, there seems to be a default position, a starting position. And I understand it, and it's legitimate, and it needs to continue, but it's not sufficient. And that default position, it seems to me, is to find fault. What's wrong with the media? How is it deficient? How is it distorting? What does it do wrong? Where are its democratic deficits? And we expend an awful lot of time and energy, rightly, in trying to analyse and expose those insufficiencies of the world of contemporary journalism. That's all well and good and necessary, so don't see me as a liberal apologist for the media. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there's possibly another perspective that we also need to bring to bear when we try and understand media and communications. And that's to recognise what media and communications, and I'm thinking particularly of the world of journalism, does well, and which is necessary to the advance of progressive causes, ideas, moral horizons within civil society more generally. And we need to recognise that in order to make sure that media and communications does it better and deeper in the future. But the default position, my argument would suggest, too often blinds us. We have one eye shut, I think, to what the media can do well, and which they do with good intentions. Some of the people who work in the media are not so dissimilar to us. In fact, there's an increasing crossover between academia and the world of journalism. So sociologically, we know that there is more interplay, more interpenetration, if you like, between the world of journalism and academia than there ever has been in the past. And that's a productive development. So that's my kind of starting position in a nutshell. How have I got to it? I think I've got to it by exploring a number of different issues, really. I was interested in teasing out the possibilities and prospects and not simply what is problematic in the world of journalism. So let me just pull on a couple of examples, and I might elaborate a little bit further in the talk this afternoon. A few years ago, I wrote a book about Stephen Lawrence, who was a young black man who was murdered in Britain. There are many young black men who have been murdered in Britain and continue to face racial attack and intimidation, as do other minorities in Britain, and it's quite likely that that will, in fact, has already become exacerbated following the Brexit debacle. Stephen Lawrence, however, was exceptional. Stephen Lawrence, this young 18-year-old want-to-be architect, became a cause célèbre within the mass media. And over a period of 10 years, which I mapped using content analysis and other techniques, peaks and troughs, but generally moving through time, becoming a huge issue, an issue that focused the minds of people in Britain, and indeed actually internationally as well, upon issues of not only this single racist murder, but what it is to live in a multicultural society like Britain in the contemporary world. So issues of race, of multiculturalism and identity became, if you like, focused in and through this particular case. that couldn't have happened without the mass media. That journalism did something quite wonderful, I think. And now there are various reasons and explanations for it, and we can have an argument about, the exact kind of weighting of those types of explanatory factors. But the fact is that particular horrific incident became well known by most people in Britain. And so it's so well known that in terms of any issue now of racial attack or murder, it's quite likely that the name Stephen Lawrence will be appended to that particular incident. It has a deep-seated cultural resonance. If you like, Stephen Lawrence has a political power after the grave. It became a watershed moment within British society in which issues of policy across the welfare state, in terms of policing, probation services, education and so on, there were a whole raft of policy changes that were spurred on by the Stephen Lawrence case. And the media, as I say, were instrumental to that. I don't believe it could have happened without mainstream media coverage. And there are a number of ideas and concepts that I try to draw upon. Raymond Williams, structures of feelings, ideas from anthropology about ritual and mediatized events, which helped to explain that cultural effervescence. That's a Durkheimian term. And cultural effervescence, which kind of galvanized people's understanding of these issues and initiated a moral sense of outrage that, as I say, penetrated, if you like, the walls of Parliament and elite institutions, and forcing change. Those ideas are not so dissimilar to the ideas of Geoffrey Alexander that inspire me in many ways, and that's why I'm going to talk about the civil sphere this afternoon. Geoffrey Alexander talks about, in some of his earlier work, mediatized public crises. These are ideas, I think, that register in a whole range of other issues. What is a mediatized public crisis? It's an issue, a controversy that brings to the surface what is quite often subterranean within contemporary societies, deep-seated senses of grievance and inequality that most people, for example, race in America, would prefer to be left buried and concealed. Certain issues, certain events can propel that to the surface, and the media can throw a spotlight on it, and it becomes a moment, a catalytic moment, when those deep-seated problems in society come to the fore, and sometimes they can affect change. Disasters, natural or perhaps disasters are very often now unnatural in the context of anthropogenic climate change, can also sometimes tip over into moments of political critique, scandal and change. They can also sometimes become moments of what Naomi Klein refers to as disaster shocks. They become moments in which, if you like, a neoliberal agenda moves in on a traumatized society to consolidate its power and pursue vested venal economic interests. This is true, but so too can some disasters open up a possibility for a deeper critique of the nature of society. And then, for example, Hurricane Katrina threw again a spotlight on racial inequality in America. So these types of moments interested me. They suggested, to my mind at least, that the media isn't always a bad thing, that sometimes the media can be instrumental in helping to propel forward issues of social change, cultural reflexivity and political critique. All right, well, something of a little bit of a backdrop. And I could talk about other studies maybe, but I'll save you from that, that also encouraged me to think a little bit more generously perhaps about the role of journalism within contemporary societies. Which brings me to what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, which is journalism in the civil sphere, subtitled Reporting Dangerously. as Geoffrey kindly noted, I've just recently written a book. I haven't actually got a copy of it yet, although it's been out a couple of months. Why is it that publishers never give authors a copy of their own book? I think it's outrageous. But having made that criticism on camera, now I better move on, I suppose, and talk about the book, which is entitled Reporting Dangerously. It's a book about journalist killings, intimidation and security, the fact that more journalists now are being killed in the world than at ever time in the past. And I wrote this book with my two co-authors, Richard Sambrook, who many of you will know as former Director of Global News at the BBC. He's worked at the BBC for over 30 years as a manager and as an editor, assigning correspondents and journalists and employing freelancers in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He's also president of the International News Safety Institute. So he has that background that he draws upon and contributes to this book. Nick Mosdell is a colleague of mine, as an experienced quantitative researcher, a statistician, crunching the numbers and looking at the patterns of killings and the types of people who are being killed and what circumstances and so on and so forth. And that data feeds into INSEE, this institute, which now monitors annually what's happening in the world to journalists. And then there's me and my contribution, which is trying to think about why is it then that more journalists are being killed than in the past? And for me, I think part of the explanation is that we have to contextualize what's happening in global and historical contexts. So I'm interested in the way in which journalism actually is part and parcel of historical processes of change that position journalists in positions of peril and potential jeopardy. But I'm also interested in the way in which the convergence of a whole range of issues and processes that are global in nature are now, if you like, converging in quite disastrous ways around the world, and that journalists now feel compelled to go and report on them. So in order to understand what's happening to journalists, I'm arguing that we need an historical perspective on the changing nature of violence and indeed how journalism positions itself in relation to that, as well as a global sense of the changing nature of some of the issues and conflicts around the world. That figure, 1,181 journalists killed since 1992, is now a little bit more than that. The INSEE figure for today is 50 journalists have been killed this year so far. 111 journalists were killed last year. These numbers are generally going up over time. Some of the myths and the mythology, in part actually constructed by the media, are that it's kind of high-profile foreign correspondents, Western correspondents, who are in the firing line in war situations. Yes, some Western correspondents do get killed in conflicts and wars overseas, and that is not good enough. One journalist being killed is not right, never mind a handful. But the fact is that most journalists who are killed are local journalists. They're indigenous to their own countries. The other part of this mythology is that, yes, wars and conflicts clearly put journalists in jeopardy, but actually journalists are being killed now on a whole range of other beats. Environmental beats, business beats, reporting on politics and other issues. So it's a little bit over half of journalists are being killed at the moment in wars and conflicts. The rest, which is not inconsiderable, are being killed in the everyday, daily types of reporting that journalists do around the world. Of course, it varies across different countries. So, as we can see here, 11 killed from Syria in last year, 7 killed from Iran, France, Iraq, Philippines, Serbia, and so on. There are hotspots around the world, and these change through time in relation to different unfolding political and conflict dynamics. 107 journalists last year, were killed, 4 support workers. Of those journalists killed, 104 of them were local and 7 were international. Different contexts of death. Richard Sambrook said, although the numbers remain shocking and impunity for killers of journalists remains the norm, the international community is taking the issue more seriously than ever. And so it is. I think there's a growing head of steam in terms of the UN, in terms of journalists, professional associations, and indeed many journalists themselves to try and get to grips with this awful problem. A problem that will never be completely ameliorated, of course, but we can't make journalists safe, or if we do, there's a high cost to be paid for that. But what we can do on the basis of the research evidence, I think, is to try and make journalists safer. And there are a number of different ways in which that can take place, and I'll talk a little bit about those later on. We live in a global world, a world of global interdependence and interconnectedness, a world of increased communications. And I just choose these 3 front pages as a way of illustrating something of that global interconnectedness. Financial markets, when they melt, economies wither around the world. Flows of capital and finance are no respecters of national borders. We live in a global world, a world predominantly capitalistic in nature, and that renders us all vulnerable to economic decisions and processes that may well have been unfolding on the other side of the world. On the far right, of course, climate change is the exemplary issue of globalization, it seems to me, in the sense that in order to address climate change, we have to see it as a worldwide problem that requires world responses. If we retreat into national bunkers, what Ulrich Beck might define as a problem of methodological nationalism, that simply is going to be insufficient for climate change. Media and communications therefore play an incredibly central role in alerting publics, but also initiating public debate and encouraging forms of response and identification with others around the world in relation to a problem like climate change. It's not only jet airliners, but now it seems big trucks and lorries that can be turned into weapons of destruction. And in terms of the events that are unfolding in Nice, a disgusting, immoral act of atrocity. But these acts too are international and transnational for the most part. They indicate a different type of terroristic activity. It's not terror that's being directed at a particular government or state as a way of trying to achieve state power or governmental power. It's actually a form of terror based upon an ideology for the most part, an ideology of hate and an ideology of an antipathy to a particular way of life or a particular way of seeing the world. It's transnational in its effects, and some people would argue it's also an index or an expression of processes of globalization. That fundamentalism is not simply an anachronistic kind of throw-up or throwback from the past. It is in fact a reaction to forces of late modernity and globalization, forcing, if you like, traditional cultures to adopt a more competitive approach. I'm not excusing these types of acts, but I'm simply asking us to consider the possibility that fundamentalism is a product of the globalizing contemporary world. It's not simply, as I say, an ancient kind of throwback response. So we live in a globally interconnected, interdependent world. And it's a world that produces a dark side, which we need to recognize, I think. And I'm talking about this because it seems to me that this in part helps to explain why it is that more journalists are being exposed to violence than they have been in the past. And here's a few ideas, I think, which help to give some substance to that generalizing claim. We live in a world where the tectonic plates of geopolitical interests have changed. It's no longer simply that kind of dualism of that defined the Cold War, but the political scene in the contemporary world is much more messy, conflictual, and difficult to work out. There are competing interests. In the context of reporting, therefore, that means that journalists are no longer necessarily seen to be assigned to one side or the other, as they would have been when reporting on the Cold War, which might have encouraged a degree of or a perception of neutrality to one extent. Wars are messy. New wars can shift and change quite quickly in terms of various factions and their allegiances, and that places journalists in a increased position of jeopardy. The nature of war and conflict is itself changing in at least three different ways in the contemporary world. Mary Cottle talks about new wars, these very vicious, very often inter-ethnic wars in immiserized or underdeveloped societies, wars in which victims become expedient, wars in which criminal gangs, as much as politically motivated military forces and entities, try and define and control territories. Ethnic cleansing is a term that is developed from this type of vicious, violent warfare. Journalists can themselves find themselves on the receiving end of that, as do increased numbers of civilians. But so too is there what Martin Shaw terms. Martin Shaw is Professor of International Relations at Sussex University. He terms a new type of Western way of war. And that too can position journalists in harm's way. So what does he mean by the new Western way of war? He means essentially a form of risk transfer warfare. That in democracies, if governments are to stay in power, they need to try and ensure that the violence, the killing of their own military is reduced to a minimum. Body bags are not good for returning body bags are not good for politicians. It saps public morale, it saps commitment to a particular political party and to the government of the day. So you deliberately engage in military strategies then that try and avoid your own military incurring too much death and annihilation. How do you do that? Well, typically you're trying to engage in military tactics that will have overwhelming firepower coordinated through new information and communication technologies, and you will try and deliver knockout blows rather than engage in boots on the ground type military activity. That means therefore that you're dropping ordnance from high in the sky, and despite militaristic claims that this is kind of precision ordnance, very often it goes awry, and again civilians cop for it. This euphemistic term, collateral damage, is an outcome in part of this new type of military strategy that's trying to avoid military casualties as a way of avoiding political risk. That too can ensnare and capture journalists, and indeed some military activities in the past, as we know in terms of Belgrade and so on, have deliberately targeted communication. So TV workers in Belgrade, that was bombed, people were killed. So two types of different warfare there that have particular implications for civilians and indeed journalists. And then this brings me to the third form of war we might want to think about, asymmetric warfare, a type of event possibly that we're witnessing today. But it's also a form of increasingly mediatized war. And this term has caused a certain amount of consternation in the academic firmament. What I meant by mediatized when I wrote a book about it over 10 years ago was simply that the media are so central, they are so intimately interconnected now with various processes and events that they're not simply reporting on those processes and events, they're actually, if you like, on the inside of them, and they are shaping them in quite sometimes distinctive and crucial ways. So in the context of warfare, mediatized war, for example, would be an example of this would be people deliberately engaging in violent acts because they will then have future influence and impact because they've been caught on camera. So this isn't simply violence being captured because it's a consequence of war in the media. This is acts of violence being actually choreographed and constructed for the media. There's a good chance they might not have been constructed if the media weren't present. And that brings me to a distinction that perhaps may have some merit, a distinction between symbolic violence and violent symbolism. Symbolic violence, as many of you will know, is a term that Pierre Bourdieu coined. And to summarize it, Pierre Bourdieu really was inviting us to think about how language encodes subtle forms of dominance and domination. We don't need to use, for example, explicit racist language to be communicating a racist message that would be based upon the presuppositions, the subtle, if you like, registers encoded within language. There's a form of symbolic violence that's being perpetrated there. If we transferred that, as I tried to do in my book, Mediatized Conflict, to imagery, images also can encode a form of symbolic violence. So an example for me would be the bombing of Baghdad and how that pyrotechnic display was picked up on by much of the media, the CNN, for example, and front pages of newspapers, saying the bombing has started, and you would see the pyrotechnic display, it's almost like fireworks. But what we don't see, of course, is the human carnage piling up beneath that high ordnance, the bombing from a high level on those people in Baghdad. That's a form of symbolic violence, it seems to me. It's a form of dissimulation. That the human consequences of this are actually being dissimulated, they're being distanced. We're not actually visually being invited to see them, we're being treated to what is an aestheticized spectacle. But there's another type of violence in the context of asymmetric mediatized war, and that's violent symbolism. Michael Ignatieff talked about this new predilection for cutting people's heads off in front of cameras as a way of sending a chill down the spine of the world. It's a propaganda coup. It's chilling. Yeah? It grabs people's attention. We don't ignore it. It scares us. We like to keep hold of our heads if we possibly can, and journalists like to keep hold of their heads. It's had a huge chilling impact on journalism in some places. That's a form of violent symbolism. This is a symbolic act that's being constructed for the purposes of media. So that too is contributing to the increased peril and jeopardy and indeed mortality of many journalists. There's a loss of neutrality now in this more complicated conflictual environment that journalists inhabit. It used to be the case, did it not, that journalists had a communications monopoly. Warlords would be fairly deferential to journalists because they would try and use journalists to get their message across or to get their propaganda out there. Warlords have their own communications technology now. That places journalists in increased jeopardy. People are not so reliant upon the mainstream media. They don't need to be so respectful or deferential. In fact, they may even see them as a threat or as a problem and deliberately target them because of that. We live in a digitalized world of new communication technologies, lightweight, portable. People can go anywhere in the world with a laptop and a mobile phone and start reporting and recording and sending up via the internet broadcast quality material. That means that more journalists can get to difficult hotspots quicker perhaps than they would have done in the past. but so too does it mean that many of them are placing themselves in jeopardy. And that raises new issues of digital security. There is a strong argument to suggest that Mary Colvin, the American journalist who was killed in Homs in Syria after a series of really powerful reports about civilian casualties, she was targeted because she used a mobile phone, and the Syrian forces could work out where she was, and they bombed that area. So there are a whole range of digital security issues that follow on from this new expansiveness of communication technologies. We live in a world of fundamentalism, as I mentioned earlier on, but also fractured, failed and failing states. And I'll talk about states in a moment in terms of the pacification of violence historically, but also international criminal networks, corporate malfeasance, international corporations who are engaging in murderous activities, which can include, on occasion, journalists, particularly when they're involved in ecological exploitation. And we just talked a little bit about transnational terrorism. All these factors, I think, are contributing to the increased jeopardy that journalists find themselves in the world today. That's the dark side of globalization. It's not all a bad news story. There's maybe some good happening in the world today if we take a really long historical view and a historical run at it. And this too, I think, helps us to explain why exactly it is then that journalists are positioning themselves, and news media position journalists in some of these highly dangerous locations. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about this. This term, the expansion of the human circle, is one that might not sit comfortably with some ears, I think. It depends on our historical perspective. If we go way back in time, we would possibly recognise that people who lived in a village may well see the people who lived in the village over the hill as foreigners, as strangers, as potentially the enemy. As we move through history and time and we witness the development of city-states who at one time would go to war with other city-states, in Greece for example, so we recognise that there's an increasing expansion of an identification. Benedict Anderson, he talked about the imagined community of the nation, the development of nation-states post the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, pacified violence, but also exported violence in relation to interstate violence. But at the same time, it developed a sense of national identification, that we belong to a certain community. There's an expansion of the human circle. There's a strong argument to say, I think, particularly in an electronically contracted world of media, that we now live in a world where we can increasingly identify with others beyond a form of national parochialism, that we live in a world of potential cosmopolitanism, to use a contemporary term, a world of transnational communications and transnational identifications. That expansion of the human circle isn't confined to cosmopolitan philosophers. It's part and parcel of living in a globalized world of travel, of communications, of migrancy, of diasporic communities, of tourism, that we live in a world where we now all have an increasing number of interconnections with people in different countries. I could use examples, but I don't need to. I think that is an empirical fact. And because of that empirical fact, we are more likely to identify with others and recognise their human hurt in contexts in which they are disadvantaged. That type of historical dynamic, which I think it compels journalism as much as it compels civil society actors around a whole host of issues now, tends, I think, to be sidelined or even silenced because of a particular allergy towards history. I think part of my argument, I would suggest, is that history needs to be brought much closer into the fold of understanding journalism and where journalism is in the contemporary. And I would kind of position my historiographic position between kind of two historiographic bookends. One is Karl Popper's book called The Poverty of Historicism, wrote in 1957, a liberal philosopher, Karl Popper, who was concerned about the way in which totalitarian ideologies were based upon a view of the inexorable forces of history, but ending in the Gulag, ending in concentration camps, and therefore decrying any attempt really to see history as a form of progressive force. So there's an anti-teleological argument based within his position, as there is in Francois Lyotard's position of the meta-narratives of history through an increased sensitivity to the way in which Enlightenment ideas are seen to be the legitimating cloak for Western interests. The study of history is seen to be simply kind of Victor's history. Well, that may no longer be simply sufficient, I don't think, in a globalizing world. We need to understand where the world is today and how it's got there, and we need to have an historical sensibility, I think, if we're to better understand that. So the argument about history is not simply that there is a kind of an unfolding Enlightenment project that we can all celebrate, nor is it simply saying that, well, no, there are only such things as kind of local narratives. We need to see the bigger picture. Journalists are part of this bigger picture. They're part of this expansion of the human circle, and therefore we need to have an historiographic sense of where they're coming from and why. A few other ideas. In human society, I think there are ideas of social justice, and these go way back in time and in relation to social hierarchies, where division of labour and power and forces of legitimation and inequality start to take root. Issues of social justice seem to be part and parcel of most human societies, I think. The arrival of axial religions, monotheism, universalizing religions that have embedded within them codes of ethics and a sense of justice can sometimes be deployed against social hierarchies. So as we see the development of some religions, so we also see the development of a possibility of an external critique of social power. Processes of democratization, not simply the development of democratic states, but also the way in which expectations of democratization, of being part and parcel of decision making, being part and parcel of everyday processes and organizations, very often involving a lack of deference or a decline in deference to social authorities, including educators. Maybe that's no bad thing. But doctors no longer have the deference, for example, that they would have done 50 years ago in many Western societies. The development of humanitarianism, drawing upon, it's not simply a product of the 19th century and charitable organisations, although in large measure given a spur by that. It goes back to religious codes and ethics, but also chivalric codes of honour in terms of warfare. This too is part and parcel of contemporary culture, as indeed is notions of human rights. Contested, challenged, but nevertheless political tools, I think, for the advancement of human progress, and increasingly, maybe on the radar, for some people at least, issues of human security. It's not simply about sovereign human rights, it's about contexts in which human rights can flourish or be abused and denied. So issues of food security, energy security, water security, environment, and so on and so forth, all need to be factored into any serious attempt to try and keep people safe, a basic human right. These ideas are part and parcel of everyday culture for many people and our contemporary thinking. Which brings me to violence, which is obviously at the sharp end of what some journalists are experiencing.
Violence shifts historically. It assumes different forms, does it not? I mentioned earlier on about the development of nation states. Norbert Elias's work, I think, is still pregnant with meaning. It still offers us an awful lot in terms of understanding the way in which, through time, there is a combination of what he calls sociogenesis and psychogenesis, the way in which, through processes of state consolidation, so violence within the territorial former territories of a nation state becomes pacified. Force returns to barracks, if you like, and makes societies more peaceful. The warrior code, the code of chivalric honour, is no longer the way in which you impress your monarch and the way in which you maintain a degree of privilege in society. So we witness the development of courtly codes of conduct. It's no longer about kind of fighting prowess, because that's now been hived off to mercenaries and standing armies. So we find aristocratic codes within European states, absolutist states, developing. Why is that important? It's important because Elias says there is a psychogenesis consequence of that people increasingly have a moral repugnance towards physical violence. If you lived in a bloody and conflictual world, you're not going to survive very long if you're a bit squeamish about violence. Okay, medieval Europe was a bloody, violent place. But nevertheless, when violence becomes pacified, it no longer has the kind of valorization that it might have had in earlier historical periods. So that requires a different form of sensibility, and a form of moral repugnance develops within people to the public display of violence. So public disemboweling and all sorts of different types of violence increasingly become displaced historically. Journalists are part of that culture where, for the most part, most of us are repulsed by acts of what Randall Collins calls ferocious violence. We live in a world, for the most part, of cruelty without pity, bureaucratic violence, high ordnance bombing, if you like, not the cutting off of heads. The reason that the cutting off of heads has so much impact upon people is precisely because people now are morally repulsed by that in a way that it probably wouldn't have been a few centuries ago. So the nature of violence is changing. We are repulsed by certain forms of violence. We may even be living in a civilization, a world civilization, which incorporates increased empathy. Jeremy Rifkin, an American scholar, talks about the empathic civilization. I think he has strong empirical warrants to say that, in part. And we could talk a little bit more about that later, I think. Bearing witness is part of the journalistic code. This too will position, all of these factors will position journalists willingly in positions of jeopardy. Why? Because they want to report on it. It's important. They feel a moral and a political, with a small p, if you like, compulsion to do so. There is an irony here, because we supposedly live in a world, although people find this highly controversial, of a decline in violence. Most states now are not engaged in state-on-state war. As I said earlier, the types of wars that characterize the world are changing. There are changing forms of violence, and there are different normative outlooks now in relation to that type of violence. When we look at violence historically, and I'm starting to do this with various bits and pieces of kind of archaeological representation, I think I can see a story, and the story goes like this, quite simply, from sort of ancient Mesopotamia, 8,000 years BC to the present. And it's a story in which representations in the past have valorized the victors. Yeah, we don't really give a damn about victims or even the vanquished in the ancient steles of Mesopotamia. But as we move through time, and as we start to think perhaps in more Eliasan terms, so we see that there's an increased recognition of the vanquished, that there are human costs and consequences to warfare. It's not simply a perfectly acceptable and legitimate kind of activity to engage in.
Fast forwarding up to the present, and what I see in a lot of the media now is an increased sensibility towards victims. That the victims of violence now are increasingly at the forefront, or if not the forefront, at least quite close to the centre of a lot of public representations, including journalism. That is part and parcel of a shift, an historical shift in the sensibility, a deep cultural sensibility. There's an historical trajectory to this. It's not happenstance that this is just happening. It's part of, if you like, a dynamic moving through time. Journalists are part of that. And just to conclude my shopping list, because I'm probably talking a bit too much, we live in a world post-Second World War in the West where we could talk about the politics of recognition in contrast to the politics of redistribution. That minority groups, women, racialized minority groups, different ethnic groups have secured and won increased recognition within the public realm. The politics is about the politics of identity. It's about trying to secure a sense of who you are and that being recognised by others. Media and communications has done an indispensable job, I think, which is not to say that they're not also highly problematic and still racist, for example. In many cases that is the case. But we can find examples of journalism doing, if you like, a good work, or at least being on the progressive side of history in those respects. And they do so through a complex journalistic ecology. And it's an ecology, I think, that invites us to think across the kind of disciplinary boundaries for those of you who are working in kind of the scholarly sort of forms of engagement with representations. It's not simply about information and the conveyance or transmission of bits and pieces of information at a cognitive level. It's also about effect and the way in which representations has a cultural resonance. So we need to engage with a kind of the symbolism and the effective display of media. So hence this term that I've coined in some things I've written in the past, that the communicative architecture and the modes of display and deliberation. We need to kind of, if you like, combine Habermas with a kind of a more post-structuralist view of communications, and that involves both the affective and the analytic. It involves expressive forms of communication as well as the exposition of argument and narrative. Increasingly it's image-based as well as ideational or idea-based. And within that panoply of different forms of journalism, making use of these different dimensions of human communication, there are opportunities and moments where journalism, I think, offers us very powerfully crafted modes of reporting that, if you like, invite us to think and to care. Which brings me to the very last kind of little conceptual idea, which is that within the world of journalism, in the context of reporting, for example, wars or disasters, there is what I would term the calculus of death. It's a highly cynical, institutionalized view of what makes something newsworthy. So the more people that die and the more horribly they die, the better that is from a newspaper or a news journalist point of view, generally speaking, because it has more newsworthy ingredients. And that is still true in large measure, I think, in terms of much reporting. And if you wanted kind of quite fine-grained analyses of different types of reporting, I'd refer you to Lily Chiriaki's work on the politics of pity and the way in which she identifies three modes of communication. One, a very restrictive, limited mode that invites no form of human compassion. Another that takes us closer to the people, the actual human beings involved in disasters, and invites us to feel and think about their plight. And it does that through various techniques. To a more ecstatic form of communication, which actually almost grabs us by the throat and encourages us, compels us to actually think long and hard about what's happening. So if you think about the way in which, for example, 9/11 was reported, that might be an indication of that. Well, this communicative architecture in my work tells me that a lot of journalists, and I've interviewed a fair few now, correspondents, care. And they inscribe within their journalism what I term an injunction to care. Some journalists do that rather cleverly and in a fairly subtle way because they don't want to be seen to be an advocate or partisan. If you work for the BBC, for example, that might be professionally very difficult to do. But you can still work for the BBC and you can still inscribe within your reporting through the use of visuals, the way in which you position victims, the way in which you elaborate narrative and talk about the human experiences of people at the sharp end. You can invite people to care about what's happening. You don't explicitly say, put your hands in your pockets, folks, or this is awful, or we need to think about this, but they can invite us, they elicit, if you like, a response through an inscribed injunction to care. Well, okay, so we have these two explanatory backdrops, I think, one historical, one global, and one historical, that helps us better understand why it is that journalists are doing what they do. We can see that in historical context, we can see it in global context. And my argument, based upon Jeffrey Alexander's work on the civil sphere, this is my argument in a nutshell. In a world of globalized communications, journalism's capacity to report from unruly, uncivil places has become geographically expanded, culturally deepened, and I suggest historically and normatively compelled. This is often overlooked in the contemporary world of academic scholarship. And I think it is. So I have an argument, really, with people who will root their position entirely within a political economy or a propaganda model view of journalism. I'm not saying those views are wrong or don't have any empirical warrants, but I'm just saying they are insufficient, and actually they're quite, I think, disrespectful of journalists who do put themselves in harm's way. They do it knowingly, and they do it not because they're adrenaline junkies, that kind of anthropological view that has a sophisticated and unsophisticated variant. They don't do it because they're adrenaline junkies, and they don't do it simply because their media bosses are telling them to do, because it's about ratings, readers, and revenue. They do it because they care. They do it because they think it's important. They have a journalistic mission. That's rooted within an idea of the civil sphere, a concept that can be contrasted with a Habermasian overly rationalistic view, a view that's allergic to the symbolic and to the transcendent. This is Jeffrey Alexander's little take on, say little take, actually, it's a profound invitation, I think. He says, the premise of the civil sphere is that societies are not governed by power alone and not fueled only by the pursuit of self-interest. Feelings for others matter, and they're structured by the boundaries of solidarity. How solidarity is structured, how far it extends, what it's composed of, these are the critical issues for every social order, and especially for orders that aim at the good life. Solidarity is possible because people are oriented not only to the here and now, but to the ideal, to the transcendent, to what they hope will be the everlasting. I thought it was a really powerful introduction to the conference, the Maori welcome. I thought it was a wonderful, beautiful thing. It grabbed my attention, the commitment and the power with which it was delivered. And I loved the words that we were invited to think about, so the stranger approaches the Maori, and the Maori says, well, why are you here? Why are you on my land? What are you doing in the world? That sense of a transcendent, of a public good, a sense of a collectivity that's not based upon individual, egotistical or market-based interests. It's bigger, it's wider. All societies, I suspect, have that sense of the public good, the collective good. And we do too, and journalists do too, and that can inform the types of journalism that becomes enacted. It's a sense of the transcendent, which sounds rather kind of grand, doesn't it, and kind of abstract. I don't think it is, actually. I think civil rights movements will deploy ideas of the transcendent. I think Obama will deploy ideas of the transcendent when he's trying to get America to shift its position on guns and gun control in America. is about what should be. It's a normative outlook that's morally informed. These types of ideas inform journalism. Okay, just to conclude, I just wanted to read 2 or 3 quotes from some of the journalists that we interviewed for the book Reporting Dangerously, that I think enabled me to make the sorts of kind of rather grand arguments that I've just inflicted on you for the last hour. This is Lindsay Hilsum, international editor of Channel 4 News, who says quite explicitly, "I have a motivation, and I think most of us do, to expose suffering in war and to show what's actually happening. So I feel a strong compulsion to explain in a very sober way, and show in a very sober way, that it's not like that, and that you should take these things seriously, and they're not a game." She goes on to say, in a kind of fairly representative way, I think, of kind of a Western journalistic view. She says, also, given the interventions from Western countries, perhaps those kind of military humanism type interventions that people have called them in recent years, also given the interventions from Western countries, from Europe and America, I think we have a responsibility to show the impact, whether for good or bad, of those interventions, and in cases lack of intervention. Thinking about the responsibility to report and responsibility to protect. Doctrine, rather. That is our job, she says, to show what's really happening out there. Not that it doesn't translate easily into saying what should be done. I'm not a something should be done-ish journalist, because quite often I don't know what should be done, and also sometimes I've got it wrong. As I said, I think that's, Lindsay is an amazing correspondent and has done some amazing work, but she's qualifying her own commitments there, because she's saying, well, I don't know all the answers. I do want people to see the human suffering, the hurt, the consequences of these political activities, but it's not my job to go further than that. That's a fairly typical Western journalistic response, I would say. But we can go to other countries, other parts of the world that are perhaps struggling in a more extreme and conflictual way with a whole range of issues, and there we find journalists being much more on side in this transcendent sense of the civil sphere. So here we have somebody from the Pakistan Press Foundation who says, of course, one of the basic responsibilities of the media is to point out violations of human rights. We have to show the truth that there is there. Abuse of powers and all those things are very much part of the responsibilities of journalists. If you look at the nature of problems, the human rights problems that occur in Pakistan, not all are related to militancy, and not all will put you in harm's way. We have terrible poverty. Children are treated really badly. They're not educated. Health conditions are atrocious. There's harassment of women. There's a whole range of things that human rights would cover, and journalists cover them. Somebody from Brazil, working at TV Global. Well, I think, he says, all journalists that work in Brazil have to have in mind the importance of their work, that when they're reporting, they're letting society know what's going wrong. So when we do a story that's dangerous, when it's decided to go on a dangerous assignment, we must be aware of the importance of the work we do. So when we are reporting against corruption, and Brazil has a lot of problems of corruption, it's important that we do that, because we don't want this to continue anymore. If it weren't for the work of journalists, society wouldn't know and would not be capable of doing to stop this. And this is the same when we report stories of violence. That's a good, I think, exposition of journalism and its implicit understanding of the civil sphere. And here, lastly, Mohammed Adaw, a foreign correspondent from Al Jazeera, who says, I believe that somebody somewhere should be taking the risk to tell their stories, to bring stories of those people to our living rooms so that their suffering is not in vain. And this is one of the things that I believe pushes me to do that. And lastly, he says, also I think it's maybe my background, coming from a region that's been marginalised by successive Kenyan governments where conflict has been the order of the day. Maybe growing up in this very volatile part of Kenya makes me go the extra mile and want to tell the stories of people who are right now in equally dangerous places. Because again, it's very easy for many people to say you can't go because of security. And it's very few who would say I have to go. There's a story that needs to be told here. So that's what keeps me going, to tell the stories of those people hidden behind those powers, those conflicting parties who almost always enjoy the limelight and deny these people the right to be heard. I guess that's probably quite a good quote to end on because I'm talking too much. But for me, they exemplify, I think, something of the way in which journalism is historically rooted. It's normatively compelled. It's embedded within deep-seated cultural outlooks which inform the practice of journalism. And I say that notwithstanding the obvious political economy of the world of journalism, and notwithstanding the way in which journalism becomes very often a propaganda tool, whether self-motivated or whether through dependence upon elite sources. And we know a lot about that type of infrastructure of the media, and a lot of us have written about it. So my argument is simply, fine, but that's not sufficient. We also need to take journalism seriously and take journalists seriously who are engaged in what I've argued is an historically and culturally compelled ambition, if you like, which is premised upon notions of, to use Jeffrey Alexander's concept, not my own, the civil sphere. And I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that wonderful, very thought-provoking talk. I know you said we didn't want to have Q&A, but we'll have a discussion.
I would much prefer a discussion. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Well, we'll have a discussion. So who would like to start?
I'd like to ask kind of a basic question because from Steve Reese, University of Texas, you know, we spend so much time these days thinking about who is a journalist, what is journalism, who qualifies to be a professional journalist. And yet in your case, it doesn't seem to really matter so much. You seem to start off with the premise that we know who journalists are, we know what they're doing, and therefore let's talk about what conditions they do it in and what capacities they have to do it with. Is there any problematic issue regarding who is a journalist, you know, that kind of enduring question these days?
Yeah, no, there are various dimensions to that. I mean, freelancers, of course, and people who are not in the employ of mainstream institutions, if they engage in this type of activity, you know, they are at increased risk. So that's one issue, I think, that when we look at the kind of the kill count of journalists and freelancers and bloggers now, I notice are being targeted by, you know, bad people who want to kill them, you know. That needs to be recognised, I think. I still think mainstream journalism plays an incredibly important and central role. I mean, we're, as a discipline, I think, are now so exorcised by the development of new social media and digital media that actually sometimes I think we start to lose a sense of the complex interplays between mainstream or legacy media and digital media. And in fact, my thinking on that is that we need better to shift our conception to an idea of media ecology and the way in which communication flows, and different types of journalism and practice are part and parcel of that communications environment. And the third response I would say, I think, to your interesting question is that in one sense it doesn't matter, because I think journalism in part is, as I said, expressive of something deeper than simply media industry and media logic and media professional training and so on. It is in fact expressive of wider cultural and shifting norms that are historically on the move. We need a long historical kind of trajectory to try and get a sense of that, and I think most of us don't see it because we're so focused on the present that we can't see actually how things might have changed through time, and sometimes progressively changed through time, you know. So yeah, just three sort of comments in response to your question. Yeah.
Johan?
Yeah, thanks. Johan Berger, Monash University. Thanks, very interesting, Simon. Embedded journalism, you know, which has been around for much, much longer, of course, than Iraq and the Falklands. You know, it goes all the way back to the First World War, really.
Yeah.
But it really came to the fore, didn't it, in the Second Iraqi War?
Yeah.
So when you did your interviews, and I'd just like to hear you talk about, you know, that, I suppose, state mechanism of trying to really stop reporting what's really happening. Did that come up, or what are your thoughts around that?
The technique of embedding journalists isn't actually, I mean, there are other historical precedents for that in my understanding, but of course what it actually means, isn't it? It's a way of trying to control and contain journalism, yeah, and journalists. And sometimes that has the most interesting study to my mind actually is studies that are rooted in phenomenology. I think about Howard Tumber's work and the way in which there is through a process of acculturation, journalists bit by bit become assimilated to a militaristic mindset, and that's what they see. But it's also rooted in a phenomenological reality, which is that if you suddenly take people from civilian the civilian norms and expectations and you plonk them into an incredibly violent context and situation, that too upsets their thinking, and they start to move to a militaristic view because they're horrified, particularly if they've got quite close to some of the military personnel and so on. In terms of embedding, am I going off the point? So
well, can they be independent? That's really
it's okay. Yeah.
more of a question, I suppose.
Yeah. The question then becomes, isn't it, well, to the extent to which journalists lose it, do they lose any kind of critical independence and faculty? There are the material and practical constraints that militaries and governments will try and use to try and contain and control them. But the real issue is, from the talk I'm sort of thinking about today, is the extent to which they would necessarily lose any independent capacity to reflect and think about war. And I see a lot of journalism which, as I said, actually tries to put the victim quite centre stage, and we see a lot of that now within war journalism, that journalists and correspondents become upset, that they are shining a torchlight, I think, on some of the horrendous activities that are perpetrated in war. And that's there too. So I'm not saying that journalism somehow manages to evade all those kind of strategic uses of control and power and abuse, which are part and parcel of reporting wars. But nevertheless, there is still a deep-seated cultural reality, I think, which informs an awful lot of journalistic reporting. And it does it in a way which is historically different, which is increasingly empathetic, which is sensitized to the points of view of victims.
Question here?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Colleen Ralph from One Action.
Oh, okay. Didn't know.
I thought the Lindsay Hilsum quote was interesting because she's looking rather altruistically at what they do, and she's got a lot of agency within her organisation. But if you look at ITN more generally these days, they have a sort of traffic light system for countries they can and cannot report in that are simply too dangerous and they won't get insured. And years ago when I was doing those interviews about Iraq, ITN journalists came up with a sort of quite complicated reasoning as to why it wasn't a story worth covering for a while, because they weren't allowed to go there, therefore it wasn't. And they would also say things like, well, you can only report it third hand, therefore it isn't really valuable. Whereas BBC journalists who are still there would say, well, it is valuable, we've got troops there, we have to be there. So, companies and foreign correspondents do kind of conceive of their own ideas of what stories, are valuable to report and when. And sometimes it's out of their hands as well.
And sometimes it is out of their hands, but the fact that you mentioned, well, the BBC thought it was still important, but the ITV didn't, and then there's freelancers, and then there are people in local areas who do, So, yes, I'm not saying that somehow the institutional frameworks of journalism, sometimes which are internally constraining and controlling, have somehow vanished, and that all journalists are out there doing the good work. But I'm saying that there is nevertheless, for many journalists, I think, a sense of compulsion to do that. And even the fact that actually certain stories aren't being reported, for some journalists, will be their kind of green light to go and do it, because they're thinking it's important and they'll put themselves in harm's way. And some freelancers do that, I think. So.
Except for Syria, maybe.
Sorry?
Except for Syria these days.
Yeah, but then that's part of the chilling effect. That's why ISIS is doing this type of activity, to deliberately try and contain and control that type of Western involvement, I think. And many of the journalists we interviewed, they said, no, there's no way they want to go to Syria. They're not going to end up in the orange jumpsuit. It chills them as it would chill you, I'm sure, and it certainly chills me.
Dr. Zaman Ahmed Messi University here. I am quite impressive, kind of thought, I guess, in terms of understanding journalism, particularly the historical and global context that you are insisting on us to focus on. That is very good. And the duty to care, or the journalist caring others, is very important. I say exactly this to my intro to journalism students.
Good.
And I think that is perfectly all right. But is that enough? That is, I wonder, and I think, but I guess you can shed some light on that. I will give one example. There are many good examples of that. Yes, journalists do care, but I wonder whether caring is always enough. I give you one example from one Australian journalist, Paul McGaw, who was the foreign editor of Sydney Morning Herald. Long ago, I encountered one of his reporting from Pakistan. You mentioned one of the reports from Pakistan. And he was reporting the porous nature of border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And he was very caring, because he wants to stop the violence across the borders in that region, volatile region. And that is a good enough reason to care. But as because Paul McGaw was not necessarily attuned to the historical context of border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, there was no social border there. There was only British-imposed border there. So he was reporting in a way as if Pakistan's central government was not doing enough to seal the border. My point is that enough? Because McGaw's perspective was not good enough to understand the complexities of those situations.
Yeah.
So in every situation, is journalist caring attitude enough to give us good perspective?
No, it's not. It's definitely not. But I would argue it's more of a necessary condition than a lot of people have credited it within the past. I think there's been, within our discipline, if I can call it that, a suspicion, I think, of human interest or human-led stories, precisely for that reason. It's seen as somehow tabloid, and it's seen as somehow sensationalist, and it's all about emotion, and there is no analysis, and we need the analysis and understanding, and you're absolutely right. But I think the most powerful forms of crafted journalism that I've seen, and I've seen a fair amount over the years, try and combine both. And that's why I was trying to work with ideas of the communicative architecture that isn't simply about display and effect and emotion. It's also about constructing different ways in which different voices and viewpoints can engage in different forms of deliberation, or even sometimes taking on a degree of editorial control to put their point of view across. So you're absolutely right. No, this kind of deep-seated cultural disposition, which is empathetic, clearly isn't enough. Politics requires analysis and differences of opinion and engagement and debate about history and the contemporary and so on and so forth. But it is a necessary part, even if it's not sufficient, I think, for mobilizing people's attentions and getting them, hopefully, to think. Yeah.
A question from Wayne. Wayne?
It's Simon Wayne Hope here from AUT. If we go back to your dark side of globalisation slide, I just wonder whether there's one particular theme that's implicit in that slide, but maybe it could be foregrounded a bit more. And this is the idea that with advances in information and communication technologies, that not only advances our capacity to communicate, it also enhances the capacities for surveillance. And they're two sides of the same coin. And it's an iron law, as David Lyne calls it. And it seems to me that a number of the cases you've already talked to us about, like the poor journalists in Syria who use the cell phone once too often. Imagine if you're in a corrupt state, narco state like Mexico or the Brazilian example, where corrupt states have ICT surveillance tactics at their disposal. It raises the stakes. And you look at what's happened to those blogging journalists in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
All you need to do is turn on your computer and you're gone. So I just wonder whether the combination of surveillance has always been there, but the capacity of ICTs to amplify it, and corrupt political and economic contexts, combined with social surveillance, of course, really does raise the risk factor to an incredibly high level compared to periods in the past?
No, I'd agree with you that, and hence the term digital security, and I've tried to emphasise that, but I mean, you can only do so much in the talk this afternoon, but absolutely, yeah. And there are all, a whole host of issues, yeah, around new technologies and digital security, yeah.
Yes, Wendy Bacon. I have been at UTS previously. I'm a journalist and also an academic researcher. Simon, I really appreciate your talk. I thought it's so good to hear someone like yourself talking in this way, and I think sort of, in a sense, getting inside journalism maybe rather than treating it as an object. And I also, so I'm more making a comment than actually asking someone a question, maybe asking for a response. Yeah. But I also feel it's sort of welcome to perhaps there is an overemphasis at conferences like this on technologies and how they're impacting on journalism. Of course, it's important. And I don't want to get away at all from the importance of the killings of journalists, which I enormously admire the courage of some of the people. But I think what you're saying has a really broader implication for understanding journalism. And in talking about Stephen Lawrence at the beginning, I think you touched on that. And a really good example, I think more broadly, is Miscarriages of Justice. Mm-hmm. And I think if you looked at Miscarriages of Justice, you would see without the impulses that you're spelling out here, there'd be very few miscarriages of justice, serious ones, ever exposed. I'd say probably in 90% of cases, it is the journalist who puts in the time to actually expose it and get it raised. Another sort of example, I think, where, and I think it's got great application to journalism education, is in speaking into silences. And the situation we've got in Australia at the moment where detention centres are black sites, and in particular these offshore, we could call them gulags. And, you know, I think there's probably 20 journalists in Australia, perhaps in total, who are determined that even if they can't go to these places, they will still keep trying to tell those stories. And it's interesting that maybe they're not at risk of being killed, certainly not. But nevertheless, they suffer symbolic violence, particularly from journalists at News Corp. So I guess my point is that I do think your work here, as with your work with Stephen Lawrence, has got a huge application, and I feel it's very important that it is deeply embedded in journalism education, and it's sort of really welcome to get away from, you know, debates about can journalists be an advocate or not, or who is a journalist and who isn't a journalist. Anyway, I really welcome what you're saying.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Thank you.
Yes, at the back.
Just a couple of small points. Project Forsyth, of course, cared in Biafra and was fired by the BBC because he cared. Second thing, for its historical interest, Stephen Lawrence's uncle was the gardener of the editor of the Mail on Sunday.
Painter, actually.
Was it?
House painter,
That's fair. That's an excellent thing. On the point about embedded reporters, I've known several of them, and obviously it's about control, but it's also about safety. You're better with soldiers who keep you safe, or they keep the sailors who keep you safe. What it appears to me that there's a growing number of adventurers who are going into these violent situations and, you know, calling themselves freelancers, but in fact they're just seeking adventure. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I'd see it more as a problem of the casualisation of journalism and the way in which mainstream journalist organisations might be inclined to make use of those types of people because it suits the political economy. You know, it's cheaper and they're there anyway, and that they're going to try and take that coverage. There have been moves afoot. I haven't really talked about the different kind of strategies and responses at, you know, at professional level and a national level and then international level to try and keep journalists safer. But one of those ways is to actually not take copy from people who have put themselves in jeopardy and they haven't been on a hazardous environment training course, you know, and they haven't done this and they haven't done the other, because you're just going to kind of
fuel that situation where you could put other people at risk in the future. Yeah, the Stephen Lawrence story is more complicated than that in terms of why Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, finally, it didn't happen at first, but finally started to kind of come on side with the Stephen Lawrence campaign to a degree, and it was the Daily Mail that plastered across its front page murderers, with faces of the suspects, and it said sue us if you don't like, obviously to try and get them into a court of law so that they would then self-incriminate. Actually, Paul Dacre at the outset of the Lawrence campaign tried to rubbish the Lawrence family. He tried to paint them in a bad light and say they were this, that and the other, and it was only later that he remembered that Neville Lawrence, Stephen Lawrence's dad, had actually done work for him. But there are other factors as well, I think. But the argument about that is about how British media as a whole kind of came on side, and for a moment at least they were pushing in the same direction before they then kind of went back to their own kind of ideological track lines and took different positions. Sorry?
It would never have happened without the person. It wasn't great benevolence on the part of the Mail, it was because of the personal.
No, I don't think it was that, actually. I mean, there's another argument that would say, no, the Mail did what they did, not because they are the champions of multiculturalism in Britain, but they don't like what they see as a kind of a gang of young thugs putting two fingers up to the British law system, they refused to give commentary, for example, in the coroner's court. They just kind of flouted the conventions of the institutional processes, and I think it was more that kind of Daily Mail conservatism that felt affronted than it was actually about the personal connection, which was quite marginal, actually. It wasn't that.
It's identifying who is the scum in the situation.
Yeah.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
This talk. Why is it important to move in our thinking about journalism from the notion of public interest to the notion of public good? Because it seems that you are implying in this. So what are the advantages of that?
I think maybe the idea of public interest seems to be you might tell me I'm wrong, but the kind of semantics that surround public interest, it kind of implies, doesn't it, we're in the here and now. There are particular issues which there is an evident public interest around. And I think what I'm talking about is, and what Jeffrey Alexander is talking about, is something quite profoundly embedded within what it is to be a social being in a particular society at a particular moment in time. It's the profundity of a cultural kind of embeddedness, if you like, not in a journalistic embedded sense, but in the sense of a societal sense. The public good is a sense of not being egotistical, not seeing a vested interest, not engaging with a particular issue. It's almost an expressiveness of what it is to be human, I think.
But it is important now to remind us that there is a public good there, and not only public interest.
I think so, don't you? Because that's premised upon the notion of social solidarities, I think, as opposed to kind of interest, which tends to be more sectionally, even if it's collective in one sense. But it's a deeper level, I think, I would argue.
I know.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for that.
All right.